What's up everyone, Devin from DEBO'S Fishing here, and today we are talking about fishing line. Now listen, hear me out, I already know what you're thinking. Debo, I've watched 1,000 videos on fishing line, but still to this day I get asked multiple times a week, what's the best line for this? Or I'm trying to get better with this certain technique, what line should I use for it? Well, today I want to simplify the process of choosing a line that works for you. So to do that, I'm going to go through each of the major line types. I'm going to talk about the important aspects and some of the disadvantages of each line, and finally give you real-world examples and tips for using each line type. So we're going to get right into it. Number one, we've got monofilament, probably the line that you started using, back in the day. This was it. This was all me and the old man used to use. Triangle XL in the red box is his favorite, and still to this day is my favorite, specifically in that crystal clear blue. That way when I pick up my combo, it's kind of got a little bit of a blue sheen to it. I know exactly which one has mono. Great things about mono is it casts really well. The Triangle XL, super smooth to cast, doesn't get memory really quick. Some of the lines out there feel kind of wiry. They get those curls in them super quick. This doesn't do that. It's affordable. You can get it on sale quite a lot, $6 or something like that for a spool of it. So it's one where if you get a backlash as you're learning, you don't have to be afraid to cut that out. It floats. So if you want to use a topwater, you're going to use braid or a monofilament or some, well, we'll get into that, but something that floats, right? So if you're doing a walk the dog or any bait where you're moving it and then stop it, you don't want that line to sink. Another great thing about monofilament is that it has a lot of stretch to it. Now, sometimes that can be good, sometimes it can be bad, but if you've got a setup that's a little bit too stiff for you and you feel like you just keep losing fish and you're fishing maybe like braid, we'll get to that, you might want to go to a mono, something that has some stretch and it absorbs the shock. To do that and keep the fish hooked is oftentimes why people will use a monofilament. So now on the flip side of that, because it has so much stretch, if you've got a really flimsy rod, you're making a big long cast and a fish grabs it, you might not be able to get hook penetration. You can't drive those hooks into the fish's mouth just because it's so soft. There's so much line with the rod that's bending. So you've really got to weigh your whole combo together, the rod, reel, line, all that working together in one. Okay, the next category we've got is copolymer, and these are not all the same. You'll have to look to see what are the advantages of this line, what are they trying to do with it. So for example, this one, the P-line topwater, I've used a lot, kind of as a replacement for mono in some cases. They say it's got a mix of nylon lines in it, so it's supposed to have a little bit better abrasion resistance. This one does float. Not all copolymers will float. It does have really low memory, just like the Triangle XL. There's some monos that don't have low memory. There's some monos that are super curly, so each one can kind of be different, but that's what they're doing with this one, is mixing different nylon lines to try to get the best of those attributes. Same thing for Yozuri Hybrid. I've liked this one. I've used it for cranking quite a bit. And this one they mix, you can see, fluorocarbon and nylon lines to help you get the invisibility underwater of fluorocarbon, but some of the stretch and some of the strength and other issues of monofilament. So a copolymer is just mixing different line types. So I can't really give you an exact advantage and disadvantage to these because everyone's different, so it really depends on what you're doing. If you want like a monofilament, but you want something that's really clear underwater, maybe you've got really finicky fish, you want to go to like an 8 or a 6 pound, something like this, good choice. Okay, third on the list, we've got fluorocarbon, one of the most talked about and probably most controversial because, listen, you'll have the old cats that say, man, I fished for monofilament for 27 years and caught more fish than you. Or you got the new guys that are saying, dude, if you're not using fluorocarbon, you're doing it wrong, man. It's the only way to fish. Okay, well, the big thing with fluorocarbon is it's going to be more expensive. You can check all around for monos. Generally, those are going to be a lot lower on the spectrum for price than a fluorocarbon. That's because the materials in it are different. I believe it's like a fluoride resin, or they've got talk about crystals. And listen, I've never made it myself, so I can't tell you for sure, but I do know that the materials that go into this are more expensive than just a regular nylon line. But when you're paying more money, you are getting some advantages. Fluorocarbon is less visible under line. You can see the guys do the tests underwater and stuff. Now, if you're fishing really muddy water, does it matter? Probably not. But if you're trying to get every little advantage that you can, you might want to look at fluorocarbon. It's also a line that doesn't float. And there's sometimes you want a lure or a presentation to get down to the bottom and stay down there. You don't want the line to be coming up or bringing it up. A Ned rig, other Texas rig jigs, things where you want it to get down there at a certain rate, you want the fluorocarbon. Comparing it to mono, like I said, mono floats. This doesn't. It's also got less stretch. Monofilament has a lot of stretch. You can take a mono line and really pull it. Not to say that fluorocarbon doesn't have any stretch. It does still have stretch, but it usually takes more power to get that line to stretch. So if you're making longer casts with stuff, you feel like you're not getting the hook set or the penetration with the hook on monofilament, you might want to try going to a fluorocarbon line if you don't want to go to a straight braid. Something like that may help. Now there's back and forth on strength of it. Some of the fluorocarbons I think do great around rocks and stuff. Some people still swear by mono. Not strength on fluorocarbon is great. A big disadvantage of fluorocarbon though is monofilament seems to be a little bit more forgiving when you start to bend it. Fluorocarbon though, if you get a bend or a kink into it, like if you have a really bad backlash and you're thumbing through it, pushing those knots, and you get a little kink or a bend in it, that will create a weak spot for fluorocarbon. So you do have to be more vigilant with your line when it gets, scrapes or cuts or nicks or any sort of bends in it to make sure you're retying often. And probably the biggest thing people don't like about fluorocarbon that I brought up earlier is that these can have that wiry, hard, stiff, tough feel to them. I mean, there's a bunch of good fluorocarbons out there. I run P-Line Tactical most of the time because it's soft. Like I said, it is more expensive, but this works really well for me. Seaguar Red Label as a budget is really hard to beat, or the Seaguar and Vizex, both are great. There's a bunch of different sun lines. They've got like the Sniper. I got a whole bunch of this when Gander Mountain went out of business. All right, and the last category is braid. Man, this line has gained a ton of popularity. I remember back in the 90s, when I first tried spider wire, it was like a square, felt like rope. It felt like I was fishing with rope, and there was like Gorilla Wire, Gorilla Thread. I remember when I first found it, I was like, oh, this stuff is awesome, man, I can't break off. And then I found out, oh my gosh, I'm stuck out there and I can't break off, so you got to cut it and ugh. Nowadays, braid has come a long way. You've got 8 carriers, you've got 4 carriers, different strands, different types. What's the deal with braid? Let's start off with my spinning rods. I run braid to a leader, either mono or fluoro, whatever I need. Because, can you see this? Can you see how thin that is? That's 10-pound line. You grab a 10-pound monofilament, it's way bigger than that. So the first advantage of braid is that it has a much smaller diameter to a similar fluorocarbon or monofilament. It's tiny. It's like a little piece of thread that you're fishing with. And the first time you use it, you're like, there's no way this is going to hold up, and it does. Going into that, the second awesome thing about braid is that because this is so small, man, you can cast a lure a country mile with this stuff. It's real thin diameter. This is the TCB braid. This is what I use on most of my spinning rods. Super thin, really soft. I mean, you can just launch a lure with braid compared to a bigger, thicker, like a 20-pound braid is tiny. Compare that to a 20-pound monofilament, it's a night and day difference. So you get better casting distance with this. Braid also has no stretch. When do I want that? On big, huge, long casts. So like when I'm frogging, I've got to fish in really, really thick stuff like the Power Pro or the Suffix 832. 50 or 65 pound have been my go-to for these because you get a fish in that really thick and it takes you down in. You don't want a whole bunch of stretch and give where that fish can shake the lure. I'm going to set the hook on that long cast. I don't want a bunch of stretch in there. I want to get those 2 big frog hooks drove into the fish's mouth, and I'm cranking it back to me as fast as I can. I'm not playing it. It's not because I can't land a fish on 4-pound mono. I can land fish on tiny stuff. But when I'm a bank angler or when I'm around a bunch of cover, that's when your line starts to suffer, right? So just, people will see 65-pound braid, bro, that's overkill. What are you doing? It's for the stuff that the fish are around. It's for a lack of stretch. It's for a whole bunch of other stuff, not just you need that thick a line to land a bass. Also with the no stretch, braid doesn't have memory. So if you want a good budget braid, the Daiwa J braid has been really good to me. And how could I not talk about the #1 advantage to braid is sensitivity. Unmatched because it has that no stretch to it. Braid sensitivity, you can feel every little pebble, every little fish nibble. Sensitivity of braid compared to the others, it's way better than the other lines. Now listen, braided fishing line is not all sunshine and rainbows because braid has no stretch. It has no shock absorption. So if I make a big cast with a heavy lure and I've got mono on it, and I get a backlash, my lure can stop and it can stretch. It can absorb that. With braid, I hear so many times people say, why do I keep casting lures off? They might not have their bait caster set up right, might not have the right combo. They cast, it backlashes a little bit, lure snaps, and snap, goes sailing out into the white abyss. That's because braid has really good pull strength, right? You can pull stuff with it, but once you start to shock it or tight snaps, braid can break. So you have to be careful of that. And going back to the no stretch thing, it can be a big disadvantage. If you've got a combo that's too stiff with braided line, you don't have any sort of shock absorption in your combo. If you're trying to play fish or letting them jump and stuff, there is a chance that they're going to throw your lure because you're going to give them just that little tiny bit of slack. So, okay, we talked about all the different line types, the advantages and disadvantages of those, but how about some real world applications? Let's start with topwater fishing. Well, if I'm fishing a topwater, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to need something that floats. And there are exceptions to that. Some people fish a whopper plopper without it. Some people fish a buzzbait on fluorocarbon. But for the most time, even when I fish those any topwater, I'm usually going to a line that floats just in case, right? It can still be kind of a pain in the butt if you're trying to fluorocarbon on some things, but everybody's different. I tend to go to either a monofilament or a braid. And specifically when I get into topwaters, frogging, I'm always going braid. I don't want any stretch in it. Everybody's different. There's some people that will tell you otherwise, but for me, a braid on a frog, I want to set that hook. I want to get that frog fish out of there as quick as I can through the pads. I don't want it getting down in there where I'm really pulling and I can't get, my lure to go, and I'm having to give it a little bit of slack and it comes off. So any sort of frogging, heavy toads and stuff like that, I'm going braid. The problem with braid is it's so limp, it can get caught in certain lures. So for example, topwater walking baits, poppers, I usually always go to a monofilament because that line has just enough stiffness to stick out in front of the lure and not get caught in that front hook. So if you're having trouble with that fishing braid, your topwater lures tend to get tangled, you might want to go with like just a little 6-foot leader of 14, 16 pound monofilament, something that has just a bit of stiffness in front of it to keep that line out in front so it's not getting tangled. But for me, if I'm tying up a topwater lure, I'm either going braid, straight mono, or you can even go braid to a leader if you so wish. Otherwise, also going to braid on any type of finesse stuff where I really need to feel the bites. So for example, any of my finesse shaky heads, Ned rigs, I'm always going braid to a fluorocarbon leader because you get the best of both worlds. The leader, I can get the, the clearness, a little bit of shock absorption. With the braid, it is unmatched in sensitivity. That's the biggest asset to braid is you can feel every little rock, every little tick, every little nibble of fish on braid. If you've never tried it and the first time you do that and you start feeling it, you're like, holy smokes. When I used to throw topwaters, I always wanted kind of a soft rod, right? You think of treble hooks, I have to have a soft rod because even though you might have 3 different treble hooks on there, it's little tiny hooks on each one of those trebles. So I make a big long cast. I want a soft rod to absorb that. Everybody says you want a cranking rod or something for treble hooks. I always used to fish mono. I'd make big long casts and I'd have a fish on for just a few turns and it would throw it. Over and over and over it would happen. And as I kind of looked at my combos more, I just found out there's way too much stretch. I could take that and put a whole ton of stretch into it before you would even get in the backbone of that rod because you've got the flimsiness of the rod, you've got the stretch of the line, especially on a longer cast, all that's amplified. The longer the cast you've got out there, the more line you've got out there, the more stretch you've got into that mono. So that's when I started switching over to braid to a leader, messing with that when I was messing with some braids. Or going to a rod that was a little bit stiffer. So instead of using a super noodly crankbait rod, I might use just a regular medium or a regular medium heavy that, is like a fast action, has a little bit of tip so you can cast it, but you're getting down to that backbone pretty quick. So that really is where it boils down to, the rod, reel, line, all of that working together for you. But just remember that because you have, X type of lure doesn't mean you always use this type of line, right? And kind of going back to the treble hook thing. Oh, if you use treble hooks, you always have to have mono. All right, and the last real world application is, I get asked so much, what's my favorite line if I could only choose one? Honestly, the best go-to for me, if I don't need a floating line, or I'm not fishing super, super crazy heavy stuff, is a 15-pound fluorocarbon. The thing is, fluorocarbon is tough, again, as long as you're retying and checking your line. It's got good abrasion resistance, so if you've got a braid, because it's made of all these little hairy fibers wound together, if you get that rubbing on a rock just a little bit, like if you're fishing a jig or a Texas rig, man, you can cut through braid like nothing. Whereas that fluorocarbon, it resists that, moves over it, it doesn't take into that, each little piece of the braid getting cut open, right? It's that solid line. So the abrasion resistance, strength, underwater clarity, and just overall use, for me, like a 15-pound fluorocarbon is my go-to. I mean, you can throw moving baits. I can throw crankbaits on it. I can throw buzz baits. Like I said, some people throw that. There's a whole bunch of different stuff you can do with a fluorocarbon. Texas rig, jigs, shaky heads. Most all of my stuff I can do on like a medium, 7-foot medium heavy with 15-pound fluorocarbon. So if I only had to choose one, that would probably be it. Now, theoretically, if I was really, really limited, it would probably be mono because it can float when I need it to, but listen, that's a whole different video. So listen, I went over all the line types, gave you some of the examples of how I use them in the real world, but I want you all to comment below and let me know what's your favorite line, or what are some things that I left out? I can't give everything in a 10-minute video, so if you've got a good tip to help somebody else out there, please do it. It's always fun reading the comments and people talking back and forth. So again, my name's Devin from DEBO'S Fishing, coming to you on the Monster Bass channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time.